everybody, Girsgirly is my name and gaming is my thing. But today I'm going to be reading The Silver Eyes from the Five Nights at Freddy's series by Scott Cawthon and Kira Breed Risley, if I can ever pronounce that right. I want to say in the beginning, I absolutely own none of this, like at all. This video will not be monetized. This video is absolutely just for your enjoyment only. All you're gonna see in this is a bunch of pictures that I took off from like Google and the Freddy Files book for things from the series or from the books and the games and all that shit. So here we go. He sees me. Charlie dropped to her hands and knees. She was wedged behind a row of arcade games, cramped in the crawl space between the consoles and the wall, tangled electrical cords and useless plugs strewn beneath her. She was cornered. The only way out was past the thing, and she wasn't fast enough to make it. She could see him stalking back and forth, catching flickers of movements through the gaps between the games. There was scarcely enough room to move, but she tried to crawl backward. Her foot caught on a cord. She stopped, contorting herself carefully to dislodge it. She heard the clash of metal on metal, and the farthest console rocked back against the wall. He hit it again, shattering the display, then attacked the next, crashing against them almost rhythmatically, tearing through the machinery, coming closer. I have to get out. I have to. The panicked thought was of no help. There was no way out. Her arm ached, and she wanted to sob aloud. Blood soaked through the tattered bandage, and it seemed as though she could feel it draining out of her. The console a few feet away crashed against the wall, and Charlie flinched. He was getting closer. She could hear the grinding of the gears and the clicking of servos even louder. Eyes closed, she could still see the way he looked at her. See the matted fur and the exposed metal beneath the synthetic flesh. Suddenly, the console in front of her was wrenched away, toppled over, thrown down like a toy. The power cords beneath her hands and knees were yanked away, and Charlie slipped, almost falling. She caught herself and looked up, just in time to see the downward swing of a hook. Welcome to Hurricane, Utah. Charlie smiled wryly at the sign and kept driving. The world didn't look any different from one side of the sign to the other, but she felt a nervous anticipation as she passed it. She didn't recognize anything. Then again, she hadn't really expected to. Not this far at the edge of town where it was all highway and empty space. She wondered what the others would look like, who they were now. 10 years ago, they'd been best friends, and then it happened, and everything ended. Well, at least for Charlie. She hadn't seen any of them since she was 7 years old. They had written all the time as kids, especially Marla, who wrote like she talked, fast and incoherent. But as they got older, they had grown apart. The letters had grown fewer and further between, and the conversations leading up to this trip had been perfunctory and full of awkward pauses. Charlie repeated their names as though to reassure herself that she still remembered them. Marla, Jessica, Lamar, Carlton, John, and Michael. Michael was the reason for the trip after all. It was 10 years since he died. 10 years since it happened. And now his parents wanted them all together for the dedication ceremony. They wanted all his old friends there when they announced the scholarship they were creating in his name. Charlie knew it was a good thing to do, but the gathering still felt slightly macabre. She shivered and turned down the air conditioning, even though she knew it was not cold. As she drove into the town center, Charlie began to recognize things. A few stores and the movie theater, which was now advertising the summer's blockbuster hit. She felt a brief moment of surprise, then smiled at herself. What did you expect? That the whole town would be unchanged, a monument to the moment of your departure frozen forever in July 1985? Well, that was exactly what she'd expected. She looked at her watch. Still a few hours to kill before they all met up. She thought about going to the movie, but she knew what she really wanted to do. Charlie made a left turn and headed out of town. 10 minutes later, she pulled to a stop and got out. The house loomed before her, its dark outline a wound in the bright blue sky. Charlie leaned back against the car, slightly dizzy. She took a moment to steady herself with deep breaths. She had known it would be here. An illicit look through her aunt's bank books a few years ago had told her that the mortgage was paid off and that Aunt Jen was still paying property taxes. It had only been 10 years. There was no reason it should have changed at all. Charlie climbed the steps slowly, taking in the peeling paint. The third stairs still had a loose board, and the rose bushes had taken over one side of the porch, their thorns biting hungrily into the wood. The door was locked, but Charlie still had her key. She had never actually used it. As she took it off from around her neck and slid it into the lock, she remembered her father putting its chain around her neck, in case you ever need it. Well, she needed it now. The door opened easily, and Charlie looked around. She didn't remember much about the first couple of years here. She had only been 3 years old, and all of the memories had faded together in a blur of child's grief and loss, of not understanding why her mother had to go away, clinging to her father every moment, not trusting the world around her unless he was there, unless she was holding tightly to him, burying herself in his flannel shirt and the smell of grease and hot metal and him. The stairs stretched straight up in front of her, but she did not move directly to them. Instead, she went to the living room, where all the furniture was still in place. She had never really noticed that as a child, but the house was a little too large for the furniture they had. Things were spread out too widely in order to fill the space. The coffee table was too far away from the couch to reach, the chair too far across the room to carry on a conversation. There was dark stain in the wooden floorboards near the center of the room. Charlie stepped around it quickly and went to the kitchen, where the cupboards had only a few pots, pans, and dishes. Charlie never felt a lack of anything as a child, but it seemed now that the unnecessary enormity of the house was a sort of apology, the attempt of a man who had lost so much to give his daughter what he could. He'd always had a way of overdoing whatever he did. The last time she was here, the house had been dark and everything felt wrong. She was carried up the stairs to her bedroom, although she was 7 years old and could have gone quicker on her own 2 feet. But Aunt Jen had stopped on the front porch, picked her up, and carried her, shielding her face as though she were a baby in the glaring sun. In her room, Aunt Jen had set Charlie down and closed the bedroom door behind them. She told her to pack her suitcase, and Charlie had cried because all her things could never fit into that small suitcase. "We can come back for the rest later," Aunt Jen said, her impatience leaking through as Charlie hovered indecisively at her dresser, trying to decide which T-shirts to bring along. They had never come back for the rest. Charlie mounted the stairs, heading to her old bedroom. The door was partially cracked, and as she opened it, she had a giddy feeling of displacement, as though her younger self might be sitting there among her toys, might look up and ask Charlie, "Who are you?" Charlie went in. Like the rest of the house, her bedroom was untouched. The walls were pale pink, and the ceiling, which sloped dramatically on one side to follow the line of the roof, was painted to match. Her old bed still stood against the wall beneath a large window. The mattress was still intact, though the sheets were gone. The window was cracked slightly open, and rotting lace curtains wavered in the gentle breeze from outside. There was a dark water stain in the paint beneath the window where the weather had gotten in over the years, betraying the house's neglect. Charlie climbed onto the bed and forced the window shut. It obeyed with a screech, and Charlie stepped back and turned her attention to the rest of the room, to her father's creations. The first night in the house, Charlie had been afraid to sleep alone. She did not remember the night, but her father told her about it often enough that the story had taken on the quality of a memory. She sat up and wailed until her father came to find her, until he scooped her up and held her and promised her he would make sure that she was never alone again. The next morning he took her by the hand and led her to the garage, where he set to work on keeping that promise. The first of his inventions was a purple rabbit, now gray with age from years of sitting in the sunlight. Her father had named him Theodore. He was the size of a 3-year-old child, her size at the time, and he had plush fur, shining eyes, and a dapper red bow tie. He didn't do much, only waved a hand, tilted his head to the side, and said in her father's voice, "I love you, Charlie." But it was enough to give her a night watcher, someone to keep her company when she could not sleep. Right now, Theodore sat in a white wicker chair in the far corner of the room. Charlie waved at him, but not activated. He didn't wave back. After Theodore, the toys had gotten more complex. Some worked and some did not. Some seemed to have permanent glitches, while others simply did not appeal to Charlie's childish imagination. She knew her father took those back to his workshop and recycled them for parts, though she did not like to watch them being dismantled. But the ones that were kept, those she loved. They were here now, looking at her expectantly, smiling. Charlie pushed a button beside her bed. It gave way stiffly, but nothing happened. She pushed it again, holding it down longer, and this time, across the room, and with a weary creak of metal on metal, the unicorn began to move. The unicorn, Charlie had named him Stanley for some reason, she could no longer remember why, was made of metal and had been painted glossy white. He trundled around the room on a circular track, bobbing his head stiffly up and down. The track squealed as Stanley rounded the corner and came to a stop beside the bed. Charlie knelt beside him on the floor and patted his flank. His glossy paint was chipped and peeling, and his face had given over to rust. His eyes were lively, gazing out of the decay. "You need a new coat of paint, Stanley," Charlie said. The unicorn stared ahead, unresponsive. At the foot of the bed there was a wheel, made of patched-together metal. It had always reminded her of something she might find on a submarine. Charlie turned it. It stopped for a moment, then gave way, rotating as it always did, and across the room the smallest closet door swung open. Out sailed Ella on a track, a child-sized doll bearing a teacup and saucer in her tiny hands like an offering. Ella's plaid dress was still crisp, and her patent leather shoes still shone. Perhaps the closet had protected her from the damage of the damp. Charlie had had an identical outfit back when she and Ella were the same height. "Hi, Ella," she said softly. As the wheel unwound, Ella retreated to the closet again, the door closing behind her. Charlie followed her. The closets had been built to align with the slant of the ceiling, and there were 3 of them. Ella lived in the short one, which was about 3.5 feet tall. Next to it was one a foot or so taller, and a third, closest to the bedroom door, was the same height as the rest of the room. She smiled, remembering. "Why do you have 3 closets?" John had demanded the first time he came over. She looked at him blankly, confused by the question. "'Cause that's how many there are," she said finally. She pointed defensively to the little one. "That one's Ella's anyway," she added. John nodded, satisfied. Charlie shook her head and opened the door to the middle closet, or tried to. The knob stopped with a jolt. It was locked. She rattled it a few times, but gave up without much conviction. She stayed crouched low to the floor and glanced up at the tallest closet, her big girl closet, that she would someday grow into. "You won't need it until you're bigger," her father would say, but that day never came. The door now hung open slightly, but Charlie didn't disturb it. It hadn't opened for her. It had only given way in time. As she moved to the stand, she noticed something shiny, half hidden under the rim of the locked middle door. She leaned forward to pick it up. It looked like a broken-off piece of circuit board. She smiled slightly. Nuts and bolts and scrap and parts had turned up all over the place once upon a time. Her father always had stray parts in his pocket. He would carry around something he was working on, set it down, and forget where it was, or worse, put it aside for safekeeping, never to be seen again. There was also a strand of hair clinging to it. She unwound it carefully from the tiny lip of the metal it was stuck on. Finally, as though she had been putting it off, Charlie crossed the room and picked up Theodore. His back had not faded in the sunlight like the front of his body, and it was still the same rich dark purple she remembered. She pressed the button at the base of his neck, but he remained lifeless. His fur was threadbare, one ear hanging loose by a single rotting thread, and through the hole she could see the green plastic of his circuit board. Charlie held her breath, listening fearfully for something. The rabbit said, with barely audible halting noise, and Charlie set him down, her face hot and her chest pinched tight. She had not really expected to hear her father's voice again. "I love you too." Charlie looked around the room. When she was a child, it had been her own magical world, and she was possessive of it. Only a few of her chosen friends were ever allowed inside. She went to her bed and sat Stanley moving on his track again. She left, closing the door behind her before the little unicorn came to a halt. She went out the back door to the driveway and stopped in the front of the garage. That had been her father's workshop. Half buried in the gravel a few feet away was a piece of metal, and Charlie went to pick it up. It was jointed in the middle, and she held it in her hands, smiling a little as she bent it back and forth. An elbow joint, she thought. I wonder who this was going to belong to. She stood in the exact spot many times before. She closed her eyes, and the memory overwhelmed her. She was a little girl again, sitting on the floor of her father's workshop, playing with scraps of wood and metal as though they were toy blocks, trying to build a tower with an uneven piece. The shop was hot, and she was sweaty. Grime was sticking to her legs, and she sat in shorts and sneakers. She could almost smell the sharp metallic odor of the soldering iron. Her father was nearby, never out of sight, working on Stanley the unicorn. Hey guys, so this is part 1. The reason it took so long to get out was because I kept messing up, and I did leave a lot of mess ups in there. I was just tired of going back and re-recording everything over and over and over again. It took me an hour to read 17 minutes of the book because I kept messing up so bad. So this is just part 1. There will be more parts soon. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.